We don't have an HIV epidemic in this country. We have a stigma epidemic. Today I want to talk about HIV, particularly the criminal laws around HIV in Ohio, and what I learned at the HIV is Not a Crime conference, also known as HINAC, H-I-N-A-C. This is their third conference, so it's known as HINAC3, and it's been held the last several days at IUPUI. You can Google that if you want to know what that is, but the university was the kind hosts for the conference, and I learned a lot. First of all, what we know is that the science around HIV has come a long way since the early 90s. People today, if they are in treatment and taking their meds and being consistent with their medication, can live nearly normal lifespans, that HIV does not have to be a death sentence anymore. Being a person who lives with HIV, your viral load is what they call undetectable, then you are untransmittable. Or not you, but the disease is untransmittable if your viral load is undetectable. We know a whole lot more today about how HIV is transferred than we did in the 80s and 90s. And as a result of not knowing much back in the 1980s and the 1990s, some really bad law was passed. What I learned today that I didn't, or not today, but last couple days that I didn't know before, was that there was actually a time when it was a very real possibility that people living with HIV would be quarantined, and that these criminal laws around the transmission of, or rather the non-disclosure of somebody's HIV status were actually considered a compromise at the time to avoid quarantine. My goodness. What I had heard, and may also be relatively true, is that when Ryan White funding started coming to the states to help support people living with HIV and HIV, that they kind of required laws of this sort. So what am I talking about? Well, in Ohio, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of the law, but basically if you fail to disclose, well, technically it's if you fail to disclose your HIV status to an intimate partner, then you can be brought up on felony charges. The problems around this are things like, well, what counts as disclosure? He said, she said. Is a text message good enough? Is a signed document good enough? Is it just a verbal that, yes, I told them, good enough? And unfortunately, often it's not. In addition to this, we've got, I heard stories today of people who find out that they're HIV positive and are really struggling with what does that mean for their lives. And there's a lot of stigma involved in being a person living with HIV. And some people take a lot of time before they can even bring themselves to tell anyone that they are a person living with HIV, let alone an intimate partner. In addition, some people fear intimate partner violence if they were to disclose information. So it's a complicated issue. Another area of intersection with HIV is mental health. And we've heard a lot about the failure of the United States to address their mental health the mental health problems we have in this country, particularly around gun violence. But we also have this problem around the HIV epidemic, with very, very few exceptions. People don't want to pass on the virus to anyone else, but sometimes mental health issues come into play, whether they're mental health issues that existed prior to becoming HIV positive or mental health issues that arise after a diagnosis. If we had better mental health, particularly mental health that was not stigmatizing to people living with HIV, I think that would go a long way to helping us end this epidemic. You might have heard me talking about people living with HIV. This way of speaking is called people first language. shout out to a friend of mine who doesn't like labels. This might be a way around it, Brian. So that the person is actually a person first, and then whatever we're going to talk about, the characteristic about them, second. So a person living with HIV and AIDS, a person with a transgender experience, so that it doesn't become the thing that defines the person, that they are a person first and they just happen to have maybe a condition, they may have certain life experiences, but that it doesn't define them, that they are a person first. I kind of like this idea, and I'm getting used to the speaking pattern that's required. So somebody who gets caught up in the criminal justice system around HIV disclosure, afterwards they carry a felony sentence. So in some states they might not be able to vote, they might not be able to get a job, they may have to be on a sex offender registry. It's, like any felony. It's a hard road to walk down afterwards. Not only that, but the stories that we hear of, relationships that break up badly, and one person decides that the way they're going to get even with with somebody else, would be to tell law enforcement that disclosure was not made. Now, let me be perfectly clear. It's the disclosure. There doesn't have to be, in order for somebody to be brought up with these felony charges, there doesn't have to be any actual transmission of the disease. They can be brought up on these felony charges if they are undetectable, which means they are untransmittable. There never has to be, in these cases, actual harm. So a person doesn't actually have to have become a person living with HIV as a result. It's a very, very difficult situation to be in. One of the things I'm working on is with a coalition in Ohio to change that reality. We're not exactly sure what that might look like in the future, but if you stay tuned, you might hear more from me. As long as we're talking about language, let me talk about a couple other things. There's a term, it's called MIPA. It stands for the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV. So in the coalitions, in the work that we're doing, we are giving priority to people living with HIV in the movement. They are the ones living with this. They are the ones who should be getting their voice heard. Another way to say that is nothing about us without us. And let me also be clear that I am HIV negative. So I'm learning, I'm an ally. And so I came to this conference today. The HIV is not a crime conference. Actually, I've been here since Sunday to learn more, and it's been fascinating. Not only just learning about the criminal code and HIV, but also about the intersections. We all know that mass incarceration of black and brown bodies plays a part in this, that it disproportionately affects people of color, transgender, or people with transgender experiences. See, everybody's working on it. People with transgender experiences, people living in poverty, sex workers. Like any mass incarceration situation, not everybody is as affected by it as other folks. Now, why are these laws still on the books? Well, some people are under the mistaken idea that these laws are going to minimize the transmission of the disease to other people and perpetuating the epidemic. The truth is, it hasn't done that. As a matter of fact, because of the stigma involved, it has actually done the opposite. People who are at risk of HIV often don't want to be tested. They don't want to know their status, because as long as they don't know that they're HIV positive, they cannot be brought up on these charges. You have to know you're HIV positive. So it's been very interesting, and I am really anxious to get into the work and do some amazing things with the amazing people from Ohio that I'm working with. Stay tuned. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you'd like to hear more as going forward, please hit the subscribe button so that you can find out when I have something, a new video come up. I do videos generally on Tuesday and Friday. Have a good week, equals. Bye. I'm going to say it one more time. We don't have an HIV epidemic in this country. We have a stigma epidemic.